This is episode 3 of the She Has a Name series. I think you're going to really enjoy it, but you'll really get the most out of it if you listen to episodes 1 and 2 first. So if you haven't, I highly recommend you go back before continuing. Also, I want to give a heads up. We talk about some heavy topics, including murder and domestic violence. Listener discretion is advised. You know, I've discovered a lot of dark things throughout my journey to find out more about Anita and what might have led to her disappearance and murder. I've also learned beautiful things, too. Details about Anita that remind me of myself, like her love of parties and celebrations. Antonio says birthdays were a big deal, a chance to have a good time. Anita would pull out all the stops.
Man, I forget how old I turned, but she threw me a party. And remember the cake had a devil on it. It did. Pitchfork and tail, you know?
These parties were full-on affairs. Balloons and games and toys for the kids. Food and music and a little smoke and card games for the adults. Everybody in the neighborhood was invited.
Half the people I didn't even know. It's just a lot of kids, you know? It was awesome. It was awesome. I just remember everybody was happy, you know, it was like a great time. I think that was my last real birthday party.
Around this time, in the late 70s, early 80s, things were looking up for Anita, it seemed. She was in her early 20s and coming out of that low point in her life with the unexpected death of her mother and all the drama with her stepfather, Leo, leaving her to care for her brother and sisters alone, only to have him come back and kick her out of the house.
She would be in tears and everything like that. And, all of a sudden she's strong again, but stronger. So, she said things were going to be okay. Things really got better.
One of the signs that things were looking up was Anita's ability to find a place to stay after Leo and Linda made her move out. Anita's sister Val says Anita and Antonio got their own apartment thanks to the help of a drug dealer friend. And soon after, Anita fell in love with a guy named James, a man Antonio fondly calls his stepdad. These were the carefree years.
I don't know. It was just, a bit more quiet around the house, I think, in terms of just, moms just seemed a little bit more happy.
Anita's new love, James, moved in with them. And for a time, they lived like one big happy family. Up until this point, Antonio didn't have much of a father figure in his life. Stephen, his biological father, as you remember, was just 14 when he was born. So he would visit, but he essentially was a kid too. They were all so young. James, on the other hand, was only in his mid-20s, but that was a few years older than Anita. So by comparison, he seemed wiser to Antonio, like a real man, a calm presence in their lives.
He was an interesting guy, yeah. He always reminded me of, you ever see, old footage of, say, the Temptations or the Stylistics or the Dramatics, He was cut from that cloth, so to speak. I think he brought a level of maturity to the situation that my mom was looking for at that time in her life. And maybe that was the attraction. I don't know. But all of a sudden, things did change, I think, for the better.
Antonio was about 9 or 10 around this time and remembers being enamored with James, but also with his mom and how she moved through the world. Anita had a hustle about her. She knew how to bring in money and make it flow through the house. Antonio had everything he needed, and he took notes. He wouldn't know it until he was much older, that every kid wasn't taught stuff like how to count large sums of money, the way Anita would teach him. Antonio had the hustle within him, too, selling lemonade to the guys playing basketball at the nearby courts, making enough money so that he could go to the arcade to buy candy.
25 cents, get you 25 pieces of candy, you know? And yeah, it was great. And, you spend 50 cents, you might get 100. And, so I would repackage them and sell them at school. And then use that money to fuel my arcade addiction.
But things weren't always so rosy. One year, Anita held a huge party for her niece Carla, who was turning 1. Val says she'll never forget that day.
On my daughter's first birthday, it was amazing. She bought her first big wheel and everything.
As always, Anita pulled out all the stops. This first birthday for Carla was lit. The kids, high on sugar from cake and ice cream, were running around, playing with balloons and taking turns riding the new big wheel. When all of a sudden,
I'm looking out the window, everything. About 7 cars pulled up. Not car, the knocks, right? They pulled up.
7 police cars, a raid. Everybody scrambled.
All this weed on the table. Because my brother was selling the weed and stuff. They was upstairs, you know what I'm saying? I'm like, oh my God, on my daughter's birthday.
Val remembers the cops charging up the stairs and struggling to bring Anita down in handcuffs.
She was a little feisty thing. She was fighting the police. Can you imagine? She was fighting the police. They cut him out. I was like, be quiet, get in the car. She just was going, oh my God. I know they probably beat her ass when she got where they took her. Oh, she was feisty too. Like, wow, I'll never forget that shit. Certain things you just never forget.
It's wild to imagine Anita fighting the cops as they were hauling her off to lock up. Everybody says how small-statured she was, 5'1" and barely 100 pounds. From what I could find, Anita was arrested twice for cocaine possession, one from 1982 and the other from 85. She was sentenced to a total of 4 years probation. Memory is a tricky thing. Some memories are so potent, you can remember every single detail. Painful ones sometimes conveniently fade away. Antonio was at that party, but he doesn't remember the arrest. He also can't really say when their idyllic life started to unravel. What we do know is that around this time, Antonio was spending more and more time with his step-grandparents, Leo and Linda. And Anita was getting deeper and deeper into the drug game. I'm Tanya Mosley, and this is She Has a Name. Episode 3, The Sinking of the Titanic. There's a depiction of Detroit that became infamous thanks to a Village Voice article in 1987 called New Jack City Eats Its Young. The piece, written by Barry Michael Cooper, was later made into the 1991 classic New Jack City starring Wesley Snipes. The movie is loosely based on the story of 2 drug networks in Detroit, Young Boys Incorporated, known as YBI, and the Chambers Brothers Drug Network.
Just say, for instance, you might have the drug kingpin, and then he would have a lieutenant. And that lieutenant would be maybe the guy that everybody else reported to. Then they have maybe some street runners, some guys that's out there actually doing the hustles. Then you have some guys out there, the spotters, that's looking, to say the police is coming, things like that.
Former Detroit detective Ira Todd says both the YBI and the Chambers Brothers represented a new kind of drug dealing. They operated like a full-on corporation, enforcing hierarchy and rules, very different from the kind of drug running police had dealt with in the past. Operating like this allowed them to flood the streets of Detroit with crack cocaine, the new drug of choice, faster than police had ever seen before.
I'm saying you can shake anybody down. and you find some crack. You knew the areas. You just go and shake this guy in this area where you knew they were selling. You know you're going to come up, shake two people down, you're going to get some crack off one. Maybe a pistol off the other. Everybody was toting guns. It was a lot of money out there, so guys could buy guns. They had the fancy cars. They had the fancy clothes.
As the automotive industry divested from Detroit, and there were no other industries to replace it, jobs of all kinds became more scarce, which means drug selling was an enticing way to make ends meet. Detroit was on the front lines of the crack cocaine epidemic. An old New York Times article from 1988 about the conviction of several members of the Chambers Brothers network noted that at its height, the group had more than 500 people moving drugs through the streets of Detroit, dealers and runners, recruiters and lookouts. And federal agents estimate the Chambers Brothers network brought in anywhere from $1 to $3 million a day. The crack houses would even compete with each other over sales. The money was flowing. But it was all one big collision course because more people selling also meant more people using.
Detroit was just like going crazy back then. And I think it was just so wild with so much money out there that some of the guys started using some of their supply. And then they started becoming crackheads. And then, then they started being killers, and it just got crazy.
Around 1985, the year of Anita's second arrest for drug possession, she and James broke up. Everyone says he was such a positive force in her life. This is around the time when Antonio began to notice a change in his mom. A new guy, or rather an old friend named Leroy, began spending more and more time at the house.
I think she was still heartbroken, big time. And I think that was the opportunity in which, this guy kind of slid in, as it were.
Antonio's Aunt Val and Uncle Frank had moved to Cleveland around this time. But when they'd go home to visit Anita, they immediately noticed the energy was off. They felt uneasy.
I guess they knew each other when they were younger, 12, 13, 14.
Leroy, as Frank remembers, had just gotten out of prison for robbing a bank.
None of us kind of liked him, but she loved him. So that was, when looking back now, that was the point of tension.
My sister Neat put him up and gave him some dope so he can build him up some money.
Anita helped Leroy get on his feet after he got out of prison. And at first it seemed like a platonic relationship because Leroy was with a woman he called his wife and had several kids.
Do you remember him at the house? Do you remember them as a couple?
Never.
Antonio is quick to say they were not in a relationship. But Leroy was clearly important to Anita, especially in the years leading up to her disappearance. Frank, who calls Antonio Tony, says nobody could make sense of it.
When he came back, he just had an abusive, dominating attitude about himself. So I can imagine how that affected Tony, seeing somebody come home from prison and have that kind of control over his mom. Because she was always the controller, and so it kind of took a lot of us by surprise.
I knew she was having a hard time. I did know that much. I wasn't that naive. To what degree, and how she was kind of moving. Obviously I really wasn't in the know of that.
Piecing it all together, we know that not only was Anita selling cocaine, she was also dabbling in it. And while she resented Linda and Leo for the past drama they'd been through, she also needed their support. Now, it's unclear to me where Anita was living during this time, but it is clear based on her actions that she knew it wasn't a good place for Antonio. Leo and Linda's was the safest and most secure place for him to be.
My mom just kind of basically telling me I'm going to be there for a while and, going to work some things out and saying, just kind of take care of yourself, and I'll be back to get you.
Anita was in her 20s, and while many of her peers were marrying off or working or maybe going to college, Anita seemed to be one of the many in the city untethered. Now today, if we saw someone struggling like this, maybe we'd be talking about an intervention or therapy. But this was the 80s, at the height of President Reagan's war on drugs. Drug sellers were vilified, and drug users were seen as weak versus wounded and in need of help. All Antonio knew back then was that his mother needed time to get herself together. And from his view, staying at Leo and Linda's was just a temporary situation. Linda says those were sad days.
When she would call and say she was coming to get him, he would just be ready. He'd put his shoes on, put his coat on, and he would be on the porch waiting for her. So we had to always let her know, don't tell him you're coming if you're not coming, because there were a couple of instances where she didn't make it. But most of the time she did come and get him.
I would just be waiting. I would just be wanting to see her, wanting, to leave and go home. You know what I'm saying?
Were you ever afraid during those times that she wouldn't come back? Were you ever afraid for her?
Never crossed my mind. I always knew that she would. But I knew that she was dealing with some things that was beyond my comprehension. And, I wasn't stupid or anything. Sometimes I would try to quiz her. But, I think she wanted me to remain a kid at that time, because I was, you know what I mean? So, she would tell me certain things, but then certain things she'll just say, no, you stay in school, stay a kid. Don't rush to get old. Take your time.
That carefree feeling Antonio had just a few years before, selling lemonade to the guys on the basketball court, spending all of his time at the arcade, that all felt a lot riskier. The city was changing. Yes, drugs played a big role, but so many factors played a part in Detroit's decline. By the time the 80s rolled around, the outcome of America's crippling recession from the 70s could be felt and seen throughout the city. So many of the automotive jobs that fueled Detroit's economic growth decades before were moved to other parts of the world where they could set up non-union shops and pay lower wages. White flight was also in full motion. In a matter of just 10 years, from 1970 to 1980, more than 300,000 white residents fled across 8 Mile to the suburbs, taking their economic power with them. All of the places Antonio loved to hang out were now boarded up storefronts, and it didn't feel safe anymore to hang out at the basketball courts. Antonio actually sees a connection between the change in the city and the change in his mom.
Detroit was not the same Detroit she'd grown up in. So much had changed. A lot of the love had just been sucked out of here. And that meant a lot of maybe her perceptions of reality may have come into question, I guess, on so many levels, principles and ideals that maybe she'd grown up with were then being challenged, right, in some way, based on the social fabric of just what Detroit was becoming, which was a war zone.
Anita's younger sister Val says, at first Anita's drug use was no big deal. They mostly did it when they were partying. So when Val started seeing Anita using around Leroy, she didn't think much about it. But when both Val and their stepmom, Linda, started seeing evidence that Anita was being abused, that's when they began to worry. There were 2 distinct incidents that both of them will never forget. Linda recalls the first one.
My husband was standing on the porch one day, and I was coming to the door. So I was standing in the door behind him, and I'm looking at him, and he's just standing there, just looking intensely down the street.
Looking down the street, Anita's stepdad, Leo, spotted her stumbling and disheveled. She could barely walk. He ran from the porch steps, scooped her up, carried her into the house and into the basement so Antonio wouldn't see her.
My husband was a nervous type person. All he could do was get him a cigarette and kind of stay upstairs. So let me go down. I go downstairs and she's holding her chest. And I'm like, you want me to rub your chest? I said, what's going on?
Anita had a black eye, and there was blood on her face and clothing. She moved in slow motion, like every movement was painful. Instead of speaking, she peeled off her blouse.
And I was so taken aback. I didn't know what to do. You could literally see this man's boot print in her chest. He was really tiny. And to see this man's boot print in her chest I've never seen anything like that in my life.
This was more than 35 years ago. And Linda says she just can't remember the name of the person Anita said did this to her. But she does remember it was a man Anita was staying with.
She said I think he literally tried to kill me today. He pushed her down in a tub of water and just held her there. And I guess at some point he let her up and fought her from that point. How she got out of that house, I don't know. But she was in bad shape. And she said, I'm not going back. She said, I can't live like this. I can't live like this.
A lot of these stories, Antonio didn't know about. He learned about this after listening back to the interview we did with Linda. And they're hard for him to hear. Hard to reconcile because of the limits of what he could have done to protect her. He was around 11 or 12 at this time. Just a kid.
Gosh, I mean, at 25, 26 years old or whatever, that had gone through such a tumultuous experience, traumatic, just everything, right? To still have that, that poise, that's,
yeah.
I mean, that'll make Maya Angelou blush. I mean, seriously,
All of what happened is in contrast to what he knows in his heart to be true about his mother. Because every time they were together, they would just have the best time. She was so present, like neither of them had a care in the world but each other. Anita stayed with Leo and Linda for a while after arriving beaten and bloodied. And to Antonio and Linda, it all felt like things were looking up. Anita's physical wounds were healing, and Antonio was happy to have his mother under the same roof. Linda says Anita made a declaration she was never going back. Until a few weeks later, when they found out she had called the guy who had done this to her.
And she got on that phone. And she called him. He came and picked her up. And that was that. She didn't come back and stay with us no more from that point.
Now, Anita's sister Val says she knows who Anita was staying with at the time. Her childhood friend Leroy, along with his wife and kids. Val was living in Cleveland, and like other times before, she just knew in her heart that she needed to go back home to Detroit to check on her sister. And when she got to Leroy's house where Anita was staying, what she saw, she says, blew her mind. Bars were in the windows and doors, and Anita, she says, couldn't even come outside to talk to her. She spoke through one of those deadbolt security doors that you need a key from the inside to open. the kind of door that is now illegal to have in Michigan because they're a fire hazard.
I say, damn. I said, with all of y'all living together, I didn't care for that. You know what I'm saying? Then what the fuck you doing? What you doing? Now, it was at the top. You have this nigga out now. This nigga took your shit. Now you sleeping down and he controlling you? And man, I used to tell her all the time, get away from that nigga. Why you get away,
What would she say?
She said, everything gonna be all right. She said she had it, She said she good.
After that short conversation, Val went back to Cleveland. And a few weeks later, she says, Anita called her up. She needed to stay with Val and Frank for a while.
We put her on a bus. He had almost killed her. Oh my God, she was hurt, She was really, really hurt, real bad. And, and I took care of her, brought her back, heal some wounds or whatever.
Like she'd said to Linda, Anita told Val she was never going back. Until 2 weeks later, when Val and Frank say Leroy showed up to their house in Cleveland.
One day, me and Frank had came back from the store, whatever. We was talking to her in front of the house and everything. A big old RV pulled up. It was Leroy. And I begged her. I'm telling my last words to my sister was, don't go, please don't go.
And we were really disappointed and had a big falling out as to why you would, call him to come pick you up, and so that puts a lot of tension there.
The best we can piece together is that this all happened in 1986, a year before Anita disappeared. Antonio was in 7th grade and still living with his step-grandparents, Linda and Leo, who were both fed up with the change in Anita. How she'd come and pick Antonio up and keep him out late into the night. Linda felt like it was confusing for Antonio. And so, for the second time in their relationship, Linda gave Anita an ultimatum.
You can't run this house and run the streets too. So we had major conflict. And so finally my husband told her that you can't bring him back at a reasonable hour. You're gonna have to make a decision. You either gonna have to keep him with you, or you bring him back. Well, she kept him with her.
Antonio describes this time period as the slow sinking of the Titanic. He loved Leo and Linda. He also loved his mom.
Gosh, yeah, that was a pretty sad day, actually. Yeah, I kind of recall, as my mom was like, she was really in a bad way, I don't know what was going on, but, the adults basically, they would get together in the dining room somewhere and kind of hash out problems. That was kind of always a meeting place, I guess you could say, in Wiley households is the dining room table.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know what happened, but it was basically like get yourself together type thing. The tough love speech and
to your mom. They were giving it to your mom.
Yeah, a lot of back and forth.
And do you remember what you were thinking at the time? Or feeling?
Yeah, just kind of confusion was running through my mind, I guess. I didn't know whether it was good or bad. Kind of how we got to that point and what was going to happen next. I just didn't know.
Anita told Antonio to grab his things. He had no idea where they were going, but he did what he was told. Anita didn't have a car at this point, so Linda, Antonio, his little cousins, and Anita all piled into the car, and Linda drove them to where they were going. The whole way there, everyone in the car sat in silence. Finally, they arrived at their destination, a nondescript building in downtown Detroit, a homeless shelter.
I remember my little cousins were like just looking at me. They were kind of looking at me different, and they just kind of waved through the back window as they pulled off. And that was the last time I would see them, for years.
I can't get out of my head how Linda says that Val and Antonio, and really everybody, idolized Anita. She was the oldest, leader of the pack, which makes this moment of desperation, arriving at a homeless shelter alone with no one else to turn to, all the more devastating. A teen pregnancy, the loss of her mother before her 18th birthday, having to fend for herself and care for her siblings and young son, meeting a guy who everyone thinks used and abused her. All of these things seemed to deepen a well of desperation for Anita that was hard to come back from. I realized that every single thing Anita experienced, I've spent my entire life being afraid what happened to me. It makes me ponder, what made the difference in my life? I also wonder where our father was during all of this. The one me and Anita share? A guy known as a giant in the city of Detroit, who barely made a dent in my life. We explore our father's relationship with Anita and our quest to understand what happened next. Because a year after Linda dropped Anita and Antonio off at that shelter, Anita would disappear forever. That's next time on She Has a Name. Now, if you or someone you love is being abused, there is help out there. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, online, by text, or by phone. Call 1-800-799-7233. That's 1-800-799-SAFE. She Has a Name is a TMI and APM Studios production. Our team includes executive producer Antonio Wiley, showrunner Nicole Hill, audio producer and sound designer Marie Mendoza, and research producer Kristen Fraser. Our music is composed by Andy Clausen, sound design and final mastering by Enrico Benjamin. APM's executive producer is Erica Kraus. Senior production manager is Nick Ryan. And APM executives in charge are Joanne Griffith and Chandra Kavadi. I'm your host, creator, and executive producer, Tanya Mosley. Special thanks to my admin, Rochelle Roberts, Ira Todd, Melissa Kuipers at NPR West, and everyone willing to talk to us about this important story. This is for us.